This is Mark with another PilotEdge tutorial. This time we're going to be covering the PilotEdge V-03 rating, which is titled Advanced VFR. This rating lets us demonstrate our skills at making VFR transitions through the LAX Class Bravo airspace. In truth, this rating really does call for some moderately advanced VFR skills. We have to make our way through the airspace surrounding one of the busiest airports in the world. To do that, we'll have to be able to exercise VOR or GPS navigation skills and be quite proficient at talking to ATC and knowing when to make the appropriate requests that will allow us to safely and legally make the two transitions that are required by the rating. This tutorial is structured just a little bit differently from my previous videos, but just in the sense that I divided it into two separate parts. One video for the overview and planning, and then a separate video for the flight itself. So let's start off by talking a little bit about what Bravo airspace is and why it exists. The Los Angeles Bravo is impossible to miss if you've ever looked at the Los Angeles sectional, terminal, or flight charts. It looks like a big blue jigsaw puzzle with kind of a crazy shape. Class Bravo airspace is only defined around the busiest airports, a designation for which LAX, as the third busiest airport in the U.S., certainly qualifies. LAX had about 1,650 aircraft movements per day in 2012. That's one takeoff or landing every minute, and that's on average. During the rush hours in the morning and evenings, there is a takeoff and landing every 30 seconds. From a controller's perspective, this means there is a near constant stream of arrivals and departures around the airport. The only way to keep everybody safe is to maintain absolute positive control over virtually every single aircraft movement within a pretty large area around the airport. And that is the purpose of Class Bravo airspace. When we look at the structure of the LAX Bravo, we see sections with a pair of numbers in them. These sections are often called shelves for a reason that will become a bit clearer in a few minutes. The numbers in each section, which sort of look like fractions, tell us the highest and lowest altitudes that define each particular shelf of the Bravo airspace. These altitudes are shown in hundreds of feet MSL, so 100 indicates 10,000 feet MSL and 50 indicates 5,000 feet. Note that the top of all of the shelves, and therefore of the entire Class Bravo, is at 10,000 feet MSL. If you're higher than this, the Bravo is not a factor for your flight because you're over the top of it. Now, like all airspace definitions, the boundaries for the shelves aren't just lines on a map. They're three-dimensional sections of the sky. If we could make all of the sections of the Bravo look solid and look at them from the side, which through the miracles of 3D graphics programs we can, the LAX Class Bravo would look like this. This is approximately the vertical scale right now, which makes it a little difficult to discern all the shelves. So let's exaggerate the vertical scale to make it easier to see. The different colors indicate shelves of different heights. As I said earlier, the top of all of the shelves is the same at 10,000 feet MSL. The fact that the bottoms of the various shelves are different is what gives the LAX Bravo its characteristic complexity, and there are 14 separate shelves. Note that the core of the Bravo, right over the airport and extending east and west, goes all the way down to the surface. This makes sense because this is where the airplanes are down low, landing and taking off. As we get further from the airport itself, the shelves get thinner and higher, which also makes sense, because these are the regions through which the planes are descending for landing or through which they're climbing to their cruise altitudes. The most obvious grouping of shelves starts about 36 miles to the east of the airport, with a shelf that's 1,000 feet tall and has its bottom at 9,000 feet. Then each shelf gets successively thicker and lower as we get closer to the airport. It's pretty intuitive that this is to allow airplanes arriving from the east to descend gradually towards the airport, but there's something pretty cool about the specific way these shelves are designed. I'll draw a scaled 3-degree descent path that starts just outside the first shelf all the way down to the runway complex. 3 degrees is a nice, comfortable descent and is typically exactly what you'd expect if you were flying an ILS approach. The glide slope for the ILS doesn't extend nearly this far out, but airliners descending via one of the standard terminal arrival routes, such as the River 2, will generally be on this 3-degree descent profile as they enter the Bravo airspace, and the shelves are designed to protect them as they descend. Now look at the core again for a moment. Notice how it's not at all symmetrical? It's much bigger to the west of the airport than to the east. At first glance, this doesn't seem to make sense. until you know that the large majority of the time LAX operates with arrivals coming from the east and landing to the west, and the departures heading out to the west before being turned to go whichever direction their destination requires. To the east of the airport, the airplanes are all funneling into the runways, so the core itself can be pretty small there. To the west, though, they're climbing and dispersing away from the airport, so the core there needs more room. There's even a little more room to the southeast because that's where many of the standard instrument departures send airplanes that want to go either to the south or the southeast. And planes that are going to the east often make sort of a left-hand U-turn shortly after departure and overfly the LAX VOR at 10,000 feet before heading out eastward. And then the planes that are going north generally just make a right-hand turn after departure and head up to the north at 6,000 feet. Let's disregard the North and South Bravo shelves for just a minute and focus on the core and the arrival and departure corridors to the immediate east and west of the core. If we were the FAA and wanted to create a safe route through the Bravo for VFR aircraft, what could we do given all the information we've just covered? Well, it may seem crazy at first glance, but the safest path through the Bravo as we have it depicted right now is to fly directly over the airport. If you think about it for a bit, you'll realize that all of the arriving and departing traffic in the immediate vicinity of the airport is either very low for planes about to land or that have just taken off, or it's very high for planes that are flying a departure procedure that takes them over the top of the Bravo. From about 2,500 feet MSL to about 4,500 feet MSL, and pretty much right over the top of the airport, there is a very safe corridor. Except perhaps in an emergency situation, no arrivals or departures will ever be in this region. And indeed, 2 of the 5 routes through the Bravo will take advantage of this fact. We'll cover the actual routes themselves in a bit, but I wanted you to see the reasoning behind why those routes are safe. Okay, now let's put the other shelves back into the mix and see what they're for. We know that they're there to protect something, so let's figure out what that something is. To start with, note that the bottom of the shelf to the north of the airport is at 5,000 feet MSL. This shelf turns out to have 2 purposes. First, there is a major arrival stream that comes from the north and merges with a smaller arrival stream from the west. All of these arrivals are funneled over the Santa Monica VOR and then fly sort of an extended right-hand traffic pattern to land, generally, on runway 24 right. These arrivals are generally level at 7,000 feet until they cross Santa Monica VOR, after which ATC has them descend to 5,000 feet. So conveniently, the north shelf protects these arrivals nicely, and by the time ATC turns them onto the base leg right around the Garvey Reservoir, they've crossed into the shelf that drops down to 2,500 feet. The turn to intercept the localizer has them in the shelf with a 2,000-foot bottom, and then they're quickly into the core for landing. The second purpose of the northern shelf is to protect departures heading to the north. These guys make a right turn after departure and climb to 6,000 feet, staying west of the Santa Monica VOR, and 1,000 feet below the arrivals that we just discussed. About the time they exit the Bravo on the north side, they're handed over to a different ATC controller who climbs them higher. The shelves to the south of the airport perform the same purposes as the north shelf. They protect arrivals coming in from the southeast, from San Diego for example, and they protect the departures that are heading to the southeast or south. These arrival and departure streams aren't nearly as intense as those coming and going from the north and from the east, but they still need protection, and that's what the southern shelves are for. Now, let's play the FAA again for a bit. Given the departure and arrival flows we've just discussed, are there any other safe paths through the Bravo airspace besides the corridor that goes right over the airport? Actually, there's an even better question. Since the path directly over the airport is really quite safe, why do we even need any other routes through the LAX Bravo? Well, I can tell you from personal experience that 30 years ago there were no other routes through the airspace around LAX. When I was flying regularly in Southern California, there was a single path through what was then called a terminal control area, or just a TCA, that went right over the top of the airport at 3,500 or 4,500 feet, depending on which direction you were going. If you were northbound, you stayed between the tower and the San Diego freeway, and if you were southbound, you stayed between the tower and the shoreline. The route was just called the VFR corridor, and that's how pretty much all general aviation flights operating under VFR got through the TCA, unless you wanted to go all the way up to 10,500 feet or higher, or I guess go all the way around it. And this worked out just fine. So why, if we're wearing our FAA hats, why should we add additional routes through what is now the LAX Bravo airspace? So while I don't know this for sure, I strongly suspect it's exactly because there was only one path through the airspace. And as the volume of general aviation traffic grew, it was becoming less safe to funnel everybody through what was really a pretty narrow corridor. Also, if you're motoring along at a typical VFR cruising altitude for a longer flight, you're probably at a more fuel efficient altitude of somewhere around 6,000 to 9,000 or so feet. And it's a pain in the neck to have to descend down to 3,500 or 4,500 feet, make your way through the VFR corridor, then climb back up to your desired cruising altitude. So for the FAA, I suspect that both of these factors came into play. They wanted to create more route diversity to help prevent congestion directly over LAX, and they wanted to make it more convenient for pilots flying VFR at higher altitudes to be able to transit the Bravo. So now that we've decided we need more routes, where can we put them that's safe? Well, if we follow the same principles that led us to conclude that flight routes directly over the top of the airport worked because arrivals and departures would either be well below us or well above us, we can probably find some parallel routes to the west and to the east where that characteristic is still true. If we look to the west of the airport just a little bit, we find the LAX VOR is right at the end of the runway complex, almost at the shoreline. That's pretty close to the midfield corridor laterally, but what if we let pilots fly higher than the midfield traffic? That seems pretty reasonable as long as we keep them below the arrival stream coming in from the west. I described that just a few minutes ago, but I'll remind you again that the arrival stream is at or above 7,000 feet until the Santa Monica VOR, and that if we limit VFR traffic to flying at, say, 6,500 feet when northwest bound, and to 5,500 feet when southeast bound, and keep them on the west side of the Santa Monica VOR, and then use the LAX VOR itself as the primary crossover point over the airport, we now have one additional corridor. And indeed, we've pretty much exactly described what the coastal route does. Looking to the east of the airport now, can we do something similar? So indeed we can, and we've got a bit more room to maneuver out that direction. There's actually room for two more paths, still parallel to the others, but up even higher. Both of the eastern transitions are at 8,500 or 9,500 feet, well above landing traffic, but also well below departures that are going to the east, who will be much higher at that point. We'll look at the details of all 5 of these transitions in just a bit, including information on where to find those details on a chart. But as the FAA team responsible for designing these transitions, we should be pretty happy with ourselves. We've created 5 separate transitions covering pretty much every VFR cruising altitude in both directions. We couldn't allow 7,500 feet southwest bound because of potential conflicts with both arriving and departing traffic on both sides of the airport. But other than that one altitude, we really did pretty darn well. Okay, let's put our pilot's hat back on and talk about Bravo transitions in general and about the specifics of the LAX Bravo transition routes. The rules for VFR operations inside of Class Bravo airspace are pretty simple, but they're also very strict. You must have a working two-way radio that covers the appropriate frequencies for talking to the ATC authorities that control the Bravo. And you must also have an encoding altimeter and Mode C capable transponder in your airplane. Indeed, you must be squawking Mode C once you're within 30 nautical miles of Class Bravo airspace, even if you haven't entered the Bravo yet. This requirement is depicted by a large magenta circle around the Class Bravo and is sometimes called the Mode C veil. Just as a reminder, Mode C, or Mode Charlie, is the setting for your transponder that encodes your altitude so ATC can see it on their radar screens. To keep everybody safely separated, ATC controllers need to know exactly where every airplane is, both laterally and vertically, and they want to know that even before they allow an airplane into Bravo airspace. You must be explicitly cleared to enter the Bravo itself, and you must stay clear of it until you are. and that can't be overstressed. You must remain clear of Bravo airspace until you hear the words cleared into the Los Angeles Bravo airspace, or whatever airspace you're about to go into. Don't anticipate that you probably will be cleared. Don't call approach just outside the Bravo and believe that by establishing communications you're okay to enter. Stay clear of the Bravo until ATC explicitly clears you to enter it. Once cleared into the Bravo, follow ATC instructions promptly and exactly. If you're flying a transition, don't deviate from the published route, not even by a little bit. There is nothing more serious or potentially dangerous to a lot of people than operating an aircraft carelessly inside of any Bravo airspace. Never forget that there could be 20 or 30 passenger airliners all operating within the same Bravo airspace that you're trying to cross through. And just for completeness, in the real world, you also have to have a private pilot's license or an appropriately endorsed student pilot certificate before you can enter Class Bravo airspace at all. But fortunately, that's not applicable to flying on PilotEdge. So with all of these rules, are you ready to take the bus instead of flying VFR through the Bravo airspace? No? Okay, good. Because while you have to know the rules and follow them, you'll see that the actual exercise of transitioning through Bravo airspace is really pretty simple and routine. Let's start the V3 rating by planning the route we want to fly. The rating calls for us to depart from John Wayne Airport, fly somewhere north of the LAX Bravo via one of the transitions, then fly back south again through a different transition and land at Torrance Airport. Somewhere north of the Bravo could be Van Nuys Airport, where we could actually land if we wanted to, but it's simpler to just make a U-turn once we're clear of the Bravo to the north and then proceed back through it to the south. So we'll plan on doing that. To help us figure out which two of the 5 Bravo transitions we want to choose, let's work backwards from the Torrance Airport. Torrance Airport has a field elevation of 103 feet, which means the pattern altitude will be about 1,100 feet. It's only about 9 miles from the LAX airport, so we'll need enough time to descend to pattern altitude unless we want to overfly the airport and then descend. That's not the worst strategy in the world, by the way, since Torrance is most often landing west on runway 29er. Still, we'll use less fuel and save time if we plan on entering a right downwind for runway 29er right at 1,100 feet. And we might even get lucky with the winds and get a straight in to runway 11 left. So, based upon what we've already discussed, even without knowing the details of the Bravo transitions yet, we know that we have routes that allow 2,500, 3,500, 5,500, and 9,500 feet available to us coming from the north to the south. Let's pause for just a second here to clear up a possible bit of confusion that may have just risen in your mind. If you said to yourself, no, wait a second, 2,500 feet, how can that be right? We'll be flying southeast. Yes, indeed we are. So how can an even 1,000 plus 500 feet be right? Well, I'm going to leave you hanging with that question for a bit because you should already know the answer. What are the VFR cruising altitude rules? Not just the odd-even part, but the other part of the VFR cruising rules. Okay, so now let's look at the transitions and we'll come back and answer that question in just a little bit. The first detail to look at is where the heck to find the details. You'll find hints of them on the Los Angeles flight chart that we're looking at here, and no mention of them at all on the sectional. The chart we need in this case is the Los Angeles Terminal Area Chart, where all 5 of the transitions are explained in gory detail on the left side of this, the TAC chart. So first up is the Los Angeles Special Flight Rules Area, one of the 2 routes that go directly over the top of LAX. Not only does this route have a special name, it has a special set of restrictions that go with it, and not the least of which is that you do not actually have to talk to ATC to use this transition. My prior admonitions about never entering Bravo airspace without an explicit clearance don't actually apply for the Special Flight Rules area. This transition seems to be the successor to the old VFR corridor that I was discussing a little bit earlier, back when Los Angeles Airport was called a TCA. You didn't need to talk to ATC for that transition either, and it sure looks to me like this is sort of a grandfathered in transition. For this route, we fly under the 5,000 foot Bravo shelves to the north and south of the airport, at 4,500 feet if we're northbound, and at 3,500 feet if we're southbound. In both directions, we track the Santa Monica 132 radial, depending upon vertical separation to keep the northbound and southbound traffic apart. Before entering the Bravo itself, we monitor the advisory frequency on 128.55. And we're supposed to change our transponder from the usual VFR squawk code of 1200 to 1201. This is fundamentally for ATC. It lets them know that we're flying the special flight rules area transition. We also should announce our entry into and our exit from the VFR special flight rules area for other pilots who might be in the area also and also listening on that same advisory frequency. And then we continue to monitor the frequency until we're well south of the area, at least a few miles. The speed limit through the special flight rules area is 140 knots, and you must have your strobes and nav lights on, which you really should have on anyway. One last note is that turbojet aircraft are prohibited from using this transition, and that wraps up the Los Angeles Special Flight Rules Area transition. Next, let's look at the mini route. This transition also goes right over the top of the airport, but this time our altitude will be 2,500 feet whether we're going north or south. You want to read the text of this transition carefully because that altitude I just gave you, the 2,500 feet in either direction, is buried in the written description rather than being nice and clearly marked on the mini route picture itself, which is something I've really never completely understood. This brings us back to the question I asked you earlier. Why is it okay to be flying at 2,500 feet when we're going southeast? The answer, if you haven't figured it out already, is because the VFR cruising altitude rules only apply once you're above 3,000 feet AGL. Below 3,000 feet AGL, you're welcome to fly any altitude you like as long as you maintain basic obstacle clearance requirements. The mini route does require an ATC clearance through the Bravo, and that's also why it's okay for both directions to be flown at 2,500 feet. ATC won't clear a northbound plane for the transition if another plane is already flying it southbound. You can think of it like a single-lane bridge with traffic signals on either side, holding traffic in one direction until the route the other direction is clear. The mini route requires good weather conditions. You need 3 miles of visibility and a ceiling of at least 3,000 feet. Both Santa Monica Airport to the north and Hawthorne Airport to the south must be in VFR conditions. This transition has the most complex of radio communication requirements of the 5. When northbound, you call Hawthorne Tower on 121.1 to coordinate the transition, or you call LAX Tower on 119.8 if Hawthorne Tower is closed. After calling Hawthorne, you proceed at 2,500 feet toward a visual reporting point at the junction of the Hawthorne and San Diego freeways. You should expect to receive a clearance through the Bravo shortly after reaching the reporting point, but do not enter the Bravo if you don't receive that clearance. Once you do receive the clearance, though, you proceed on the Santa Monica 128 radial, noting that your course will be the reciprocal of that, and you'll be on a heading of 308. This will take you just about directly over the numbers of runway 24 left. You'll then exit the Bravo on the north side in another minute or so, and you can expect a frequency change instruction from ATC once they see that you're clear. When southbound, you call Santa Monica Tower on 120.1 to coordinate the transition, or you call LAX Tower on 119.8 again if Santa Monica Tower is closed. Once you talk to the tower, proceed at 2,500 feet on the Santa Monica 128 radial, which will also in this case be a heading of 128 degrees. Again, you'll cross over the numbers of runway 24 left and then exit the Bravo a minute or two later on the south. And again, you can expect a frequency change from ATC as you clear the Bravo airspace. Next, let's look at the coastal route. We already sort of described this transition when we were playing FAA, but let's fill in the details now. The coastal route northbound is flown at 6,500 feet MSL and starts all the way down at the Long Beach Harbor when you're abeam a visual reporting point called the Vincent Thomas Bridge. This transition will be coordinated through SoCal Approach, whom you should contact on 127.2 if you're not already talking to them for flight following. If you're using GPS to fly this route, the southern starting point is an intersection called Wilma, which will put us directly on the LAX 123 degree radial, which is what the transition calls for us to fly northbound. Again, note that this, since we're northbound, our heading will be the reciprocal of this, or 303 degrees. The Wilmot intersection and the Vincent St. Thomas Bridge are just outside the 5,000 foot Bravo shelf that we're about to penetrate at 6,500 feet. So you should make sure you call SoCal approach for your transition clearance well before you reach the bridge. And don't forget, you must not enter the Bravo without that clearance. Once cleared into the Bravo northbound, proceed direct to the LAX VOR on the 123 radial. And as you cross over the VOR, make a 20 degree right turn to 323 degrees and track that radial outbound. Because of your altitude on this transition, you'll remain in the Bravo for quite some time, all the way to the northern border. And this will roughly happen when you're over the little mountain range that separates the San Fernando Valley from the Los Angeles Basin. Once clear, and assuming that you're just going to be making a U-turn over the San Fernando Valley, expect SoCal to cut you loose with a frequency change. One particular thing to note about this transition when flying northbound: if you've got an autopilot with altitude hold capability, this transition is an excellent time to make use of it. At 6,500 feet, you have very little altitude buffer between flights that are departing to the north at 6,000 feet from LAX and flights arriving from the west at 7,000 feet. Southbound on this transition, you'd call SoCal approach on 134.2 well before you reach the Sepulveda Pass, tracking inbound on the LAX 323 radial, which will be a heading of 143 degrees in this case, and you'll be at 5,500 feet in this direction. Once cleared into the Bravo, you fly directly to the LAX VOR and then make a slight left turn to a heading of 123 degrees and track the LAX 123 radial until you're clear of the Bravo. And that will be about the time that you reach the Long Beach Harbor on the south. The last two transition routes, the Coliseum route and the Hollywood Park route, are very similar to each other. They're both routes to the east of the LAX airport and are both flown at 8,500 or 9,500 feet depending upon your direction of flight. I won't go through these two transitions in the same detail as the others we just covered, because by now I'm sure you see how to read the transition details and what the general pattern is to follow for requesting and flying transitions. Note that that both the Coliseum and Hollywood Park transitions are designed for use when LAX is landing in its normal configuration, that is, when runways 24 and 25 left and right are in use. If LAX is landing east, those transitions may not be available, and you may not be able to get clearance for either of them. In all cases where an explicit clearance through the Bravo is required, which is true for 4 of the 5 transitions, make sure that you call the appropriate ATC authority well in advance of reaching the Bravo boundary. One final comment in this vein. Remember that in real life, Class Bravo airspaces are extremely busy places. If you're planning on getting your pilot's license in the real world, or if you already are a pilot but haven't flown in busy airspace yet, here's a very important thing to remember. ATC does not have to let you into the Bravo if they're busy, and they will be busy almost all of the time. Do not expect to fly up close to the Bravo boundary and get cleared for a transition just in the nick of time to cross through it. In real life, it won't happen that easily. In real life, you'll sometimes be lucky to get a word in edgewise to an approach controller who might be handling 15 or 20 airplanes. And if they're busy, even if you can get in a radio call, you're not going to get a transition clearance instantly. It's not at all uncommon to hear something like, "Aircraft calling SoCal approach, remain clear of the Los Angeles Bravo airspace and call back in 5 minutes." You have no choice but to turn away from the Bravo boundary and orbit safely outside of the airspace until you can get a clearance. Now, in the LAX area, you actually do have an alternate choice. You can use the Special Flight Rules area transition without needing any ATC or clearance. So whichever transition you were planning, make sure you've got the Special Flight Rules transition instructions also at hand. But be careful about that, though. If it's so busy that you can't get ATC's attention, remember that other VFR, general aviation pilots, are having the same problem. and the special VFR area might turn out to be a pretty busy place as well. So make very sure you make good use of the advisory frequency and both listening and telling other pilots what you're doing. Back to planning for our V3 rating now, and still working backwards from Torrance. We need to decide which transition southbound we'll fly. We've already noted that Torrance Airport is pretty close to LAX, so we have to decide if we're going to overfly Torrance from north to south using something like the coastal route, or if we're going to use the special flight rules area or the mini route to ensure we can reach pattern altitude about the time we reach the Torrance Airport. Frankly, either approach works just fine. Overflying obviously leads to a longer flight, but allows for an unhurried descent over the Long Beach Harbor and plenty of time to listen to the Torrance ATIS. Choosing either the special flight rules area or mini route transitions, on the other hand, puts us in position to make a downwind entry to runway 29 right at Torrance, which keeps our flight time to a minimum. So either approach really works just fine. One thing to pay attention to, however, is that the Class Bravo isn't the only airspace to take into consideration. Note that the Hawthorne Airport Class Delta airspace is immediately adjacent to the LAX Bravo. The Hawthorne Delta's ceiling is at 2,500 feet, as indicated by this symbol. If we fly the special flight rule area transition, we'll be at 3,500 feet as we exit the Bravo, well above the Hawthorne Delta. So we just need to ensure we don't descend any lower than, say, 2,600 feet while we're over the Hawthorne airspace. The Torrance Delta is just south of Hawthorne, and since we're landing at Torrance, we have to be sure that we call the tower before we descend down into their delta. A good place to do that is the visual reporting point VPLSR, which has the not-so-elegant name of Hawthorne and 405 freeways. If we're flying the mini route, the delta consideration becomes more significant, since as we exit the Bravo at 2,500 feet, we'll already be inside the Hawthorne Delta. Fortunately, ATC is going to help us out here by handing us over to the Hawthorne Tower just before we exit the Bravo. And Hawthorne Tower will in turn hand us over to Torrance Tower. Because I like as much help from ATC as I can get, I'm going to choose the mini route southbound for this tutorial. Now let's consider our choices for the northbound transition. Since we're flying the mini route southbound, that's eliminated because we need two different transitions for the rating. I'm also going to eliminate the Hollywood Park and Coliseum routes. They're just too far east for what we want to accomplish with the rating flight, and it will take too long to climb to 8,500 feet, which is what both of them require for the northwest direction of flight. So that leaves us to choose between the special flight rules area transition or the coastal route. The SFRA transition will be at 4,500 feet and doesn't require any communications with ATC. The coastal route requires us to climb to 6,500 feet, which is still a pretty good climb, but we'll have plenty of time to do it, and it provides a really nice view of the Los Angeles airport as we cross over it. We'd also be under the watchful eye of SoCal Approach throughout the coastal transition, and they'd be providing both traffic advisories and separation for us while we're in the Bravo. So again, either approach is fine. For the tutorial, I'm going to choose the coastal route to make maximum use of ATC services. Okay, so with the transitions chosen, let's construct a flight plan for the entire route. Right from the start of our planning, I'm going to assume we'll be using flight following services from SoCal Approach because A, it's safer, and B, it actually reduces our workload once we're in the air. When we call clearance delivery on the ground at John Wayne, we'll tell them our general route of flight and that we're going to want the coastal route transition through the LAX Bravo. They'll coordinate the transition for us, keep us on the same squawk code all the way through the Bravo, and save us having to figure out where to call SoCal Approach to request the transition in the air. We'll depart KSNA under positive control since we're inside Class Charlie airspace, then be released to our own navigation once we're clear of the Charlie. At that point, we'll climb to 6,500 feet direct to the Wilma intersection. Wilma is a beam the Vincent Thomas Bridge and is directly on the Los Angeles 123 degree radial. If you don't have GPS in your plane, just plan on intercepting the LAX 123 radial while you're still southeast of the Long Beach Harbor, and then fly direct to the LAX VOR on that radial, a course of 303 degrees with no wind. Somewhere south of the bridge, we'll be expecting our Bravo clearance. And if we haven't received it by the time we're 4 to 5 miles southeast of the bridge, we'll contact SoCal Approach and ask about it, because we cannot enter the Bravo without explicit clearance. Once cleared, though, we'll track inbound to the LAX on that radial, the 123, and then make a 20-degree right turn to a track outbound on the LAX 323 radial until we exit the Bravo on the north. As we exit the Bravo on the north, we'll hear something like the following from ATC. Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, leaving the Los Angeles airspace. Radar services terminated. Squawk VFR. We have to get turned around now and make our way back to the Santa Monica VOR, which is the starting point for the mini route transition southbound. We'll be at 6,500 feet as we complete the coastal transition, and we need to be at 2,500 feet by the time we reach the Santa Monica VOR at the beginning of the mini route transition. We need to be quite conscious of the Burbank Charlie airspace just below us. We're right on the edge of it as we exit the Los Angeles Bravo. There are two different ways we can deal with the Class Charlie. First, we can simply make a descending left turn, which will take us away from the Charlie boundary. And if we descend all the way down to 2,900 feet, we'll be below the Charlie shelf when we start back to the south. The second way to deal with the Burbank Charlie in this situation is to hook back up with SoCal Approach on the north side of the Bravo, letting them know we'll be maneuvering near the edge of the Charlie shelf in preparation for a return trip south back through the LAX Bravo via the mini route. When SoCal Approach tries to cut us loose as we exit the Bravo, we can just tell them that we'd like to continue flight following, and they'll let us keep our existing squawk code and hand us over to the SoCal Approach controller responsible for the airspace on the north side of the Bravo. With flight following engaged, we can then dial in the Santa Monica VOR, make a descending turn down to 3,500 feet or so in either direction, and proceed direct to the Santa Monica VOR. As we've already seen, Santa Monica VOR is the starting point for the mini route transition that we'll fly to get back through the LAX Bravo on our way to Torrance. The mini route is coordinated by Santa Monica Tower whenever that airport is open. And since we're currently talking, or we will be talking to SoCal Approach, we will actually have to request a frequency change before we call Santa Monica Airport Tower. This is easy to forget when flying the mini route. So I request the frequency change when I'm about 10 miles from the Santa Monica VOR and start my descent then to 2,500 feet just as I cross over the top of the coastal mountain range that separates the San Fernando Valley from the LA Basin. So 10 miles out may seem a little early to request a frequency change, but you'll see why I requested that early in just a minute. As we discussed earlier, Santa Monica Tower will be the authority that clears us through the Class Bravo airspace on the mini route, and then eventually will hand us over to Los Angeles Tower. Los Angeles Tower, in turn, will hand us off to Hawthorne Tower, and if we tell Hawthorne Tower that we're landing at Torrance, they'll hand us off to Torrance Tower. All of these handoffs happen pretty close together, so we'll want to try to stay ahead of things by keeping the next frequency dialed into the standby position on our radio before we need it. Torrance Tower is going to expect us to have the current weather when we call them for landing. So with all of the handoffs and frequency changes going on, when are we ever going to have a chance to actually listen to the Torrance ATIS? Remember that if we're talking to an ATC facility, we must not change frequencies without their permission. Well, there are a couple of strategies for getting the ATIS. The simplest, and the one we'll use over and over again on any flight where we have flight following active, is to just ask ATC for permission to change frequencies while we get the weather for our destination. They're usually fine with us doing this, and they'll say something like, Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, frequency change approved, report back up. We change over to the ATIS frequency, have a listen to the weather, and then change back to the ATC frequency we were just on, and simply tell them SoCal Approach Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo is back on frequency. Another strategy that works in this particular case is to wait until we ask SoCal Departure for the frequency change to talk to Santa Monica Tower. Once they grant that request, we can actually change to the Torrance ATIS first and have a listen, and then contact Santa Monica Tower. When they give us permission for a frequency change, they are not specifically telling us to immediately contact Santa Monica Tower. If that's what they wanted, then they would say Cessna 123 Alpha Bravo, contact Santa Monica Tower on 120.1. But that's not what they'll tell us. What they will tell us is frequency change approved. That frees us up to actually change frequencies enlisted into the ATIS and then change to the Santa Monica Tower frequency and give them a call. And this is the reason that I'm going to ask for the frequency change a little further out than is strictly necessary to get just in contact with Santa Monica. What I like about this approach is that it minimizes communications with ATC. And while that's not such a big deal when flying on PilotEdge, it's a good objective to keep in mind when flying real world in busy airspace. Okay, and now we're pretty much done. We've picked up the Torrance ATIS before we started the mini route transition, flew the mini route, and are finally talking to Torrance Tower. If they're landing in normal configuration, we'll be told to make a right downwind entry for runway 29 right. We'll descend down to 1,100 feet, which is the Torrance pattern altitude, and then just make a routine 45-degree entry to the downwind leg for runway 29 right. We don't even really have to maneuver for the entry. The heading we're on from the mini route transition puts us almost perfectly on the necessary heading for the pattern entry at Torrance. Execute a normal landing from the pattern, and after you leave the runway and taxi to parking, you should find that you have passed the V3 rating. So that pretty much now covers all the planning and all the overview that we need in order to do this rating. So in part 2 of the video, we will actually have the cockpit video and fly the rating itself. See you there.